Welcome back to Let's Make a Game. In this video, I would like to give an example of something that, if you're making a game, you should do quite regularly, which is just play the game or play, what has been completed of the game, because my game certainly isn't complete, um, with the attitude of, as much as possible, um, acting as if you don't know how the game works. In other words, trying to approach it as you think a typical player who's not familiar with the game would approach it. Although, of course, that can be difficult. So this isn't, I suppose it is a sort of playtesting, but when people talk about playtesting in the context of computer games, they usually talk about the next stage where you have strangers playing your game and giving you feedback. But this is a sort of earlier stage of that, because I don't feel that my game is anywhere near ready for that, for sort of the proper or full play testing. But it's something that you should be doing early and often. I personally would say I probably haven't been doing it as much as I should. But anyway, that's what we're going to do today in this video. So, as I said, I'm going to try and approach it as much as possible as if I don't know how the game works, and maybe try and sort of make choices that aren't the choices that I normally make, because of course that will bring up parts of the game that I don't see as often. And I'm going to keep doing this until I either have an error which I can fix, or something that's not an error but it's just sort of, it's patently not fun. It's something that the experience of the game isn't what I thought it would be when I was programming it, and I can see what needs to change. Or perhaps I'll sort of complete part of the game and there won't be anything egregiously wrong, but I'll want to then think about, okay, well, what's the next thing that I should be adding to the game? So I'm going to start, and I'm going to run it in a different browser this time. Normally I run it in Chrome. So let's begin by running it in Firefox and seeing what happens. Okay, so thus far everything looks the same. I mean, it should, but normally I pick a random character. I suppose I'll do that again, but okay, so that looks okay so far. All right, so I look at my character. Would a normal I suppose the thing that strikes me first is, would a normal person understand what these abbreviations are? STRINT, DEX, etc. And I think they would if they were familiar with tabletop role-playing games. I think I'm sort of implicitly writing this for someone who is familiar, let's say someone who at least has played Dungeons and Dragons. Because, I mean, if you looked at those pictures, there's nothing that says this one's a dwarf and it's got high constitution, or this one's a troll or an orc and it's got sort of low intelligence and a large size, for example. Those are all conventions, and I suppose looking at it with this mentality does make me wonder: am I sort of assuming too much background knowledge? And of course, some people will say no, and some people will say yes, basically depending on whether they've got that background knowledge. But it is a thing to think about, that it might be worth explaining what's happening. I mean, I haven't explained what scale this is on. I've used a scale that is very common in tabletop role-playing games, which is that 20 is roughly the highest possible, 18 is perhaps the highest possible, and then 20 is sort of superhuman, perhaps, and 10 is about average, and 1 is the lowest possible. but would a person? Does everyone necessarily know that? Um, Again, I don't have any sort of firm conclusions about what I should do, but again, I sort of note that if a person was familiar with tabletop role-playing games, they would probably say, "Oh yeah, okay, that's Constitution. He's got very high Constitution. He's got very high Strength. Um, he's got very low Charisma, and that is sort of what you'd expect for a dwarf character. But those are all sort of learned conventions, and yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've only stepped back for 5 seconds, and I'm considering things that um, I hadn't really considered before. I know these arrows look bad. That does strike me, but that's not a new thing. I always knew they looked bad. Um, I noticed that the picture is sort of asymmetric. I don't know how noticeable it is, but I don't know if this is a thing of I'm more finicky because I made the game, but I can see that these left hand arrows are much closer to the picture than the right hand arrows are. In terms of up and down or north and south, it seems to be about right. So you're at the dungeon entrance. You may leave the dungeon if you wish. I'm going to assume that probably most people know what a dungeon is, or at least most people who are going to play this game probably roughly know what a dungeon is. I'm wondering how is it obvious that this is meant to indicate a crossroads? I honestly don't know. Is it obvious? I don't think the fast and the slow arrows. I think they're actually not obvious now that I think about it. I think perhaps I would expect a person to go, okay, well, these arrows probably indicate direction, but I don't think someone would know why there's two of them. I'd feel kind of like most people probably wouldn't immediately work out what the difference was. So I think that's a note to perhaps have some sort of note at the bottom that says use the. I won't say the white arrows and the red arrows because I'd like to change that anyway. But click this one to go slow and this one to go cautiously and this one to go quickly or something like that. So here we are. We're only a minute in. It's amazing what leaps out at you. It can be quite unpleasant because you've sort of assumed that this is all very smooth and obvious. But once you get into the headspace of, well, not everyone's you and not everyone knows what you know. It's amazing how much leaps out at you. But anyway, let's continue. All right, I'd like to go north. Okay, and if I can see that these arrows aren't clickable, so I think I'd probably twig. Perhaps I'd probably twig that, the filled in arrows mean you can go that way, and the not filled in arrows mean you can't. I don't think I would notice that my oil was going down. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, though, because it's quite possible that someone might play this game and run out of oil and it suddenly says, oh, you've run out of oil and you die. And that's probably quite a sort of unpleasant surprise. But I think maybe that's an appropriate effect because, of course, you can always start again. Like once you die, that's not the end of your game, really. If you don't want it to be, you can start again, and maybe suddenly dying because you weren't keeping an eye on your oil because nobody told you to keep an eye on your oil is sort of a lesson that makes sense in terms of the world. That it is a dangerous place. It's meant to be a dangerous dungeon. It's not meant to be. What can I say? This isn't a tutorial level, right? It's not. It's a game that it's a game where you can hope for what's meant to be a game where your character can die quite quickly and easily, and that you need to be reasonably careful. So that is a thing that I think could come as a surprise to a new player, but I'm not necessarily perceiving it as a problem. Anyway, so having gone north, let's. I notice. I mean, I'm glad that the oil does seem to be going down in the way that it should be, which is good. So I'm sort of keeping an eye on this with two minds, I suppose. One with the mind of me knowing what's meant to happen, but also trying to look at it as a new player. Now I've changed the percentages. I briefly mentioned this in a previous video that I had the percentage of a special location and the percentage of a settlement up really high because it just made it quicker to get to them because those were the bits that I was testing or demonstrating. But I've moved it back to more what I wanted for the finished product. In other words, a much lower chance of encountering anything. And I'm starting to wonder if maybe the way I had it before was better, because I've clicked a few things and nothing's happened so far. Nothing really. I mean, the oil's gone down, but as I've said, I don't think people would notice that. I'm wondering whether this is too much exploration before something happens. So that's a note to maybe tweak the. Maybe not quite put them back to where they were, but at least sort of maybe have more, either have more settlements or think about more things that could happen other than encountering settlements. But either way, have more encounters per click, if that makes sense. All right, so I have come to a settlement eventually. You see a settlement up ahead. The denizens resemble disembodied floating heads of wolves. So I can try to scare them away, try to sneak through without being seen, go back the way I came, or I can approach them with a posture which is humble, informal, formal, or haughty. So let's assume that I either haven't sort of made the connection between these different strategies and what characteristic might be good or bad for particular strategies. Let's say that I try to scare them away. The monsters attack. Oh, and I rolled a 20, so there you go. The monsters flee from you in terror. Loot the settlement or continue on. Well, let's be a typical tabletop role player and loot the settlement. You leave the settlement. Okay, so there you go. You find a scroll giving instructions to cast Undefined. So that is an example of what I was looking for, really, which is, here's a thing that I thought that I'd done, the bit where you can loot the settlement. I've tested it a couple of times. It worked fine. I don't know that I've ever tested it on a video, but I certainly tested it in between making these videos. And I sort of thought that was a bit that was done and working fine. But no, turns out it's not. Turns out I've made some sort of mistake. So that's given me something to work on and fix. So I suppose I would. It would depend on how much time I had, but normally this is probably going to be fairly simple to fix. So I'd probably fix that, run the game again, and then come back and do a bit more playtesting, if we want to call it playtesting. But for the purposes of the video, I feel like I've sort of demonstrated the mentality that one can get into. I mean, it's given me a lot of ideas for things that I think probably should be fixed to make the game more fun. But it's certainly here's a sort of, okay, I've got to definitely fix this first, and then when I've done that, I can look at the more sort of optional stuff. So I'm going to do some more testing over the next couple of videos probably. So I hope that was interesting or useful to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.